My son called our family bakery, the work of my entire life, a failure, and put it up for sale for less than the price of a used car. He laughed, said that old yeast and recipes meant nothing to anyone. He didn't know that the secret of our bakery was never in the rolls or the bread. It was hidden beneath the cellar, under a wooden hatch known only to me and my father. And when the auction hammer struck the wood, the game began, but not the way he expected. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Arthur Bennett. I was 78 years old when my son decided the bakery wasn't worth saving. I had spent my life inside those flour-dusted walls, and the truth is, I never imagined myself anywhere else. It wasn't just a building to me. It was a breathing, living space, timber and brick, yeast and sweat, silence and heat. I didn't run a business. I preserved a bloodline. The bakery stood on the corner of Elliott and 3rd in a quiet part of Trenton, New Jersey. It had been in our family since 1919. The original sign, faded gold lettering on a black wooden plank, still hung above the window. Bennett & Sons, bread and biscuits. Time had worn the paint thin, but you could still see the lines carved deep by my grandfather's hands. I unlocked the door each morning at 4:30, well before the sun crawled over the rooftops. The key was cold in my palm, smooth from decades of use. As I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards greeted me, like a voice whispering, "Welcome home." The smell hit first, a deep fermented blend of old yeast, wood smoke, and flour. Not the scent of something dead or forgotten, but something settled, lived in, trusted. I flipped the switch near the door and heard the slow hum of the ovens waking up in the back. Those ovens were older than me, big cast iron beasts built into the wall. My father had taught me to fire them when I was 8. He taught me how to listen for the changes in heat, the creak of metal, the dryness in the air, the way steam shifted across a tray. We didn't use thermometers back then. We used our hands, our eyes, our instincts. The work table near the window was covered with burlap sacks of flour and a scattering of measuring cups. The wooden countertop had been sanded smooth by generations of rolling pins. Deep along the grain were the notches where my grandfather marked batch sizes, dough weight, delivery counts. The numbers were barely visible now, but I could still feel them beneath my fingers, ghosts of calculations that once meant survival. I walked through the space slowly, touching everything, not out of routine, but reverence. The proofing cabinet with its glass doors still fogged from the night before. The antique scale, slightly crooked but accurate to the gram. The drawer of handwritten recipe cards, smudged and warped by time, each one a map to something sacred. My father's rye bread, my mother's molasses rolls, my own cinnamon knots, each one created, refined, and passed on not by intention, but by memory. This place held more than flour and sugar. It held echoes. In the far corner, under the high shelf of bagged sugar, was the old stool I used to sit on when I was too young to reach the table. My father would give me a lump of dough to play with while he worked. I remembered the way his hands moved, broad, steady, folding with purpose. I learned to imitate him, even before I understood the why of what he was doing. It wasn't just the process, it was the posture, the rhythm, the silence. Baking wasn't just about ingredients, it was about time, heat, waiting, patience. My father used to say that bread doesn't rise because you tell it to. It rises because it's ready. You don't force it. You don't rush it. You create the space, and you let it become. I looked up at the ceiling. The wooden beams were stained with decades of heat and moisture. Tiny hooks still hung from the rafters, where we once strung herbs to dry, or tied bags of starter to ferment. The brick wall near the ovens had absorbed thousands of days of warmth, its surface darker in spots, like fingerprints pressed over a century. There was a spot just above the second oven, charred black from a small fire my father had once put out with nothing but a sack of flour and a soaked rag. The mark was still there. We never repainted it. Outside, the street was still quiet. The world hadn't begun moving yet, but in that bakery, time already had. The dough I had left in the cooler the night before was ready to be turned. I took off my jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and began the work I had done for over 60 years. My fingers knew the motion before my brain did. Scoop, measure, pour, fold, knead. I wasn't tired. Not then. Not ever when I was inside those walls. Even when the arthritis throbbed or my back twinged, I felt most alive with my hands in dough. My body knew what it meant to wake before the sun, to earn the light. And even if the lines on my face deepened and my knuckles stiffened, there was still something untouched inside me, something passed down through fathers and sons, something baked into bone. This place had seen births, deaths, recessions, wars. It had been robbed, nearly burned down, nearly bought out. But it endured. Because it wasn't just a bakery, it was a ledger of who we were. It was where I told my father I wanted to leave college, where I asked my wife to marry me, where I cradled my son for the first time, holding him in one arm while kneading with the other. He had cried at the scent of yeast. I had laughed. I thought it meant he would be a baker, too. The idea stayed with me for years. I had raised him here, let him play in flour, roll cookie dough, deliver morning loaves to the neighborhood. But as he grew older, I watched him start to flinch at the work. He liked the smell, not the sweat. Liked the idea of family, not the commitment. He wanted newness, expansion, data. But bakeries don't run on numbers. They run on trust. I never blamed him. Not fully. Not until he stopped coming at all. But in those early hours, before the city stirred, none of that mattered yet. There was still the oven, still the counter, still the silence of a space that had always known me more honestly than any person ever could. I was 78, and I was still baking, not because I had to, but because it was the only place where the world still made sense. It started with spreadsheets, not conversations, not arguments, not even quiet suggestions over coffee. Just numbers, lines and columns, forecasts and losses, margins, projections, digital printouts pressed flat against the table I used to knead dough on. My son brought them in like blueprints for a future he didn't want me to question. I remember the first time he laid them down, smiling, enthusiastic, his voice full of something he believed was clarity. He thought he was helping. That was the hardest part. Tom was 42, a man now, a husband, a father, a businessman. He wore slim-cut suits and leather shoes that never scuffed. He spoke in terms of efficiency and optimization. He had a degree in finance, a title I never understood, and a confidence that came from reading articles about modernization and scalability. He used words like declining asset and legacy liability without irony. But he hadn't set foot in the bakery before noon in over 10 years. When he arrived that day, briefcase in hand, I was dusting flour off the front counter and placing the last tray of oat loaves into the display. It was late morning. The regulars had come and gone. The street outside hummed with weekday rhythm. He walked in like a man entering a waiting room, polite, composed, detached. He glanced around like a guest. He didn't even notice the new coat of varnish I had applied to the shelves. He talked for 30 minutes straight, about costs, energy bills, equipment maintenance, payroll liability, supply chain disruptions. He pointed to charts, colored lines dipping downward, red text highlighting net losses over the past 6 quarters. He explained how flour prices had risen, how foot traffic had declined, how digital ordering was the new frontier. He spoke of burn rate and fixed versus variable costs like he was presenting to a boardroom, not to his father. I listened, not because I agreed, but because I was trying to hear something else beneath the numbers. Some fragment of the boy who used to sit on a stool beside the oven, his legs too short to reach the floor, his mouth full of warm biscuit. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who looked at the bakery and saw inefficiency. He said we needed to face reality, that the bakery wasn't profitable, that it was time to pivot and transition. He had spoken to a real estate agent, quietly, just to get a sense of value. Just exploring options, he said, like it was a bad marriage and not a century of sweat. He said it with that smile I had come to dread, the one that made him sound like he was giving a gift, the kind of smile people use when they've already decided what's best for you and are just waiting for your signature to make it official. I didn't say anything, not because I agreed, because I didn't want to break. Tom didn't understand the bakery. He understood the shell of it, the brand, the idea, the address, but not the thing itself. He didn't know the rhythm of the yeast, the weight of a well-proofed boule, the instinct it took to judge a crust by sound. He didn't know the names of the early morning customers who still paid in cash. He didn't remember which wood made the ovens breathe best. He thought the bakery was the problem. But the numbers were never the story. I looked down at his papers, the ones he'd printed on thick stock with bold fonts and color-coded charts. And all I saw were pages that had never touched the workbench, never absorbed the smell of roasted rye, never once gotten stuck together with honey glaze. He said we could sell, said we'd keep the name, said we could open something smaller, more efficient, downtown, closer to the new market district, something refreshed, with better margins, and less emotional drag. I stared at him while he talked, and in my mind, I saw my father hauling sacks of flour up the back steps in winter. I saw my mother boiling raisins for her tea bread on Sundays. I saw myself at 25, sanding the floor with my bare hands. I saw customers laughing, crying, ordering cake for their daughter's graduation, and then again for her wedding. I saw 3 generations of fingerprints in the same flour bin. None of that was in his charts. He stood in front of the front counter and gestured like a man closing a deal. He thought the building was tired. He thought I was tired. He thought he was being merciful. But what he didn't know, what he never bothered to ask, was that this place wasn't dying. It was waiting. I nodded at the right times. I even took the packet he handed me, neatly stapled and labeled. I placed it on the counter like it belonged there. But inside, something had already shifted. Not in anger, not in grief, in readiness. He left that afternoon, saying he'd give me a few days to think. He patted my shoulder like a child visiting a nursing home. Then he disappeared through the front door, not noticing the flour on his shoes. That night, I sat alone in the bakery. I turned off all the lights. I listened to the walls creak and settle. I let the silence breathe around me. And then I went into the back, past the ovens, past the storage racks, down the stairs behind the cooler, into the basement, and then further. There was a key. There was a door. And behind that door, the part of the bakery Tom had never seen. The part he had never asked about. The part that was never in the numbers. The sound came before the letter. A low knock on the old wood of my front door, too firm to be a neighbor and too punctual to be an accident. I had just finished scraping the last bits of dried batter from the mixing bowl and was setting it out to dry when I heard it. The kind of knock that arrives with an agenda. I dried my hands on a towel older than my son's marriage and walked slowly to answer it, already suspecting who might be on the other side. He didn't come alone. Tom stood there, shoulders back, dressed in a jacket that didn't quite match the season. Behind him stood a woman in a trim gray suit, clutching a leather folder to her chest like a shield. She was young, professional, eyes sharp but rehearsed. She didn't look at me like a person, but like a form to be signed. She introduced herself with a soft voice and a neutral expression, calling herself a legal facilitator, neutral, objective, simply here to help. The folder opened before I could invite them in. They walked past me into my own living room, like they belonged there. Tom glanced around, barely looking at the photos on the wall, the ones he used to beg me to hang straighter. His eyes were on the coffee table. The woman placed the folder there with deliberate precision. Inside were papers I recognized but had not yet seen. Transfer forms, deed reassignment, financial disclosures, sale agreements, notarized paragraphs in cool clinical fonts, the paperwork to hand over everything. They didn't ask if I was ready. They assumed. Tom spoke in that soothing tone he always used when he thought I needed help understanding. He talked about finalizing the transition, about getting ahead of things, about how the new owners were eager to move quickly. His words floated in the air like perfume, meant to cover the stench of something rotten. He smiled too often, a little too widely, as if trying to reassure himself this was the right path. But my eyes weren't on him. They were on the woman. Because I recognized her, not from the legal office she claimed to represent, but from much further back. Her name hadn't been said aloud yet, but her face pulled a thread loose in my memory. Years ago, I had stood in a hospital hallway beside a man dying of something the doctors couldn't cure. He was my oldest friend, the man who had taught me to weld copper pipes and knead dough with the heel of the palm, and the girl who sat at his bedside, clutching a paperback novel she never finished. That was her. She was his daughter. She didn't know I knew. Or maybe she did, but she never looked me in the eye. Tom thought she was a stranger, a disinterested party, an agent of process. He didn't know she had sat at our kitchen table as a child, eating sugar cookies I'd taught her father to make. He didn't know I had once paid a semester of her college tuition when she was about to drop out. He didn't know because he never asked. I asked if I could take a moment to read through the papers. They nodded, relieved. I took the folder in my hands. It felt heavier than it looked. Each page carried weight, not just of ink and legality, but of the years it had taken to build what they were trying to erase. I read every word, slowly, silently, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted them to watch me not breaking. The terms were clean, too clean. They offered me a modest payout, enough to live comfortably, as the phrasing went, enough to disappear without protest. But beneath the calm language was a quiet violence, a hammer wrapped in velvet, falling on something that could not be replaced. Tom said something about legacy, about preserving what we could. He mentioned the bakery's symbolic value and how emotions shouldn't stand in the way of smart decisions. He used the word inevitable twice. He didn't hear the tremor in his own voice. He was convincing himself, not me. When he finished, the room fell silent. The woman watched me. Her hands were folded neatly, but her thumbs fidgeted. There was a crack in her composure, something unspoken threading between us. I wondered if she remembered the tin box her father once gave me to keep safe. I wondered if she remembered the stories he told about the basement of the bakery, the real basement, the one that wasn't listed on any blueprint. I wondered if she knew what I had buried there before she was born. I closed the folder. I thanked them for their time. Tom looked startled. He wasn't used to me being polite at the wrong moment. I said I would need a few days to consider, that I didn't want to rush something so inevitable. I used his own word, handed it back to him like a stone to carry. He tried to smile again, but it faltered. He was beginning to sense something wasn't as simple as he thought. They left shortly after. She said nothing as she walked past me, but her eyes caught mine for a breath too long. There was a flicker there, of regret, or warning, or maybe memory. I didn't press it. I didn't need to. When the door shut, I carried the folder to the kitchen. I placed it beside the old recipe book my father had written in by hand, page by page, ink smudged by flour-dusted fingers. I looked at both side by side. One was filled with margins and liabilities. The other was filled with life. Later that night, I walked back to the bakery. It was closed. The windows reflected the amber streetlights and the parking meters below. I unlocked the back door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, faintly sweet. I moved past the racks, past the crates, and into the corner where the old trap door waited. I opened it. The stairs creaked in protest. Below was stone, earth, and secrets. I placed the folder on the table that hadn't seen daylight in 50 years. The hammer had fallen, but they didn't know what it had struck. The bakery was quiet in the late hours, long after the scent of sugar and spice had faded into a gentle memory, and the hum of mixers gave way to the low creak of old wooden beams settling in for the night. I stood behind the counter, my palms pressed against the cool marble surface, listening not to the silence above, but to the air below. There had always been something different about the basement. Not eerie, not frightening, but aware. It was a silence that breathed, as though the stones themselves remembered more than they were ever meant to hold. I hadn't gone down there in years. After Margaret passed, I told myself there was no need. The recipes were committed to memory, the rare ingredients sourced through habit, and the records left untouched. But when Ethan laughed at the idea that the bakery held anything of worth, when he scoffed and said it should be leveled, I felt a tug inside me, a pull from deeper than logic or nostalgia. A call from the shadows beneath the floor. The basement wasn't large, but it was dense with memory. The narrow wooden staircase groaned under my steps, just as it always had. The light switch buzzed for a second before the single bulb flickered to life, casting long amber shadows against the stone walls. Dust hung suspended in the air, thick and slow-moving, as if reluctant to be disturbed. I walked past the old storage shelves, past the racks of disused baking tins, and the faded crates of handwritten labels no one had read in decades. I moved toward the far wall, the one that curved slightly inward, where the cement was rougher than the rest and the air a touch cooler. There was a seam there, so faint it could be mistaken for a crack in the plaster. But I remembered carving it, years ago, with Margaret kneeling beside me, both of us sweating from fear and hope. We had sworn never to speak of it again, not even to Ethan. Especially not to Ethan. Not because we didn't trust him then, but because trust was a thing of the moment, and what lay beneath the floor was meant for another kind of bond entirely. I knelt slowly, my knees cracking in protest, and pulled aside the old rug that covered the panel. My fingers found the latch without looking. It had rusted over time, but it still lifted with a reluctant groan, revealing a square section of wood fitted into the concrete like a forgotten door. I removed the panel and stared into the blackness below. A rush of stale, cold air met my face, and with it, the familiar metallic scent of old safety. Beneath the bakery was a room that had no business existing. It had been dug by hand decades ago, before zoning laws or permits, back when my father ran the place. He built it not for flour or sugar, but for protection. During the war, during the riots, even during the gas leak in '74, it had served as a shelter. But over time, it became more than that. It became the archive, the safe, the vault of everything we couldn't afford to lose, and everything we couldn't let the world see. The ladder creaked under my weight, but I descended one rung at a time, letting the dark fold over me like a slow breath. When my feet touched the ground, I stood in a room no larger than a modest bedroom, its walls lined with sealed boxes, filing cabinets, and carefully wrapped cloth parcels. At the far end stood the steel cabinet, the one with the heavy dial and the handle that only turned if you knew the trick of the wrist, the one my father taught me at 17. Inside that safe was the reason Ethan would never understand this place. It wasn't about cakes or cupcakes or the Friday donut line. It wasn't about revenue sheets or monthly losses. It was about value, legacy, things too heavy for a spreadsheet. I opened the safe, slowly, feeling the weight of decades shift around me. Inside, there were envelopes marked with dates from the 50s, photographs too sensitive to display, original land deeds, and notarized letters from city officials long dead. Most importantly, there was the original agreement, the paper that confirmed the bakery's location as a protected structure under a grandfather clause the city had quietly removed from the public registry. A clause that made any attempt to sell or demolish the property subject to automatic legal review, contingent upon the approval of the surviving founder or their designated heir. That heir was me. Ethan had no idea this clause existed because we never filed it digitally. The agreement had been deliberately kept analog, buried in a safe beneath a trapdoor, beneath a rug, beneath layers of flour-dusted tradition. He saw a crumbling storefront and an empty register. I saw a sealed lockbox of history, waiting for the right moment to breathe again. I replaced the documents and locked the safe, the click of the mechanism echoing like a promise through the narrow chamber. Before climbing back up, I looked around the room again, not to take inventory, but to feel the shape of my family's intention. Everything down there had been chosen, preserved, protected. Ethan had looked at the bakery like it was an inconvenience, a weight on his modern ambitions. He hadn't understood the foundation beneath his own feet. When I emerged from the basement, I closed the panel and replaced the rug. I turned off the light and climbed the stairs, slower than before, but steadier somehow. I didn't know what Ethan's next move would be, but I now understood mine. The bakery would fall if I let it, but under the floor, in the dark, we still had leverage, not because of secrets, but because of memory, because of the things that grow stronger when left untouched too long. He had looked for power in the wrong place. I still held it, not in my hands, but in the ground beneath our name. That morning, the wind coming through the alley behind the bakery carried with it a bite that reminded me of colder years. It wasn't winter yet, but the light had turned that color, pale, worn, and quiet. The kind of light that made everything look older. I unlocked the back door and stepped inside, feeling the familiar resistance of the door frame that had always needed sanding, but never got it. The scent of yeast and burnt sugar lingered, mixed with something faintly metallic, like old coins or forgotten keys. I let the silence settle around me and went to the office, the one Ethan had once called the museum room. He had laughed when he said it, flipping through the old ledgers like they were props from a play that no longer had an audience. But he had missed the drawer beneath the ledgers, the one with the uneven handle and the false back. I opened it now with slow fingers. It groaned like a voice waking from long sleep. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth and bound with string, were the letters. Not receipts or orders or client lists, but real letters. Some handwritten in ink that had faded into a soft blue-gray, others typed on yellowing paper, the ribbon marks still sharp. Each envelope had a year. Each one was addressed to me or to Margaret, and a few were still sealed. I hadn't read them all. Some I couldn't bring myself to open. But today, I needed to remember. I lifted the bundle and carried it to the back room, where the morning light struck the far wall. I sat on the floor and untied the string, careful not to disturb the dust too much. The first letter I opened was from 1979. The handwriting was firm, angled, impatient in a familiar way. It was from my father. He had written it before passing the business on to me, before he left Ohio for the last time, and settled into silence in Arizona. His words weren't warm, but they were deliberate. He had warned me, not about ovens or suppliers, but about people. about the way trust thins when money thickens, about the dangers of forgetting what built the place we stood in. He had written in black ink that the flower wasn't the secret, the people were. That if I let the wrong one in behind the counter, they'd rot the place from the inside, like mold behind the tiles. He hadn't named names, but I understood him better now than I ever had when he was alive. The next letter was from Margaret. The envelope was dated 3 weeks after Ethan was born. The paper smelled like the cedar box she had kept it in. Her script was smaller, more fluid, as though she had written it while holding the baby. She had written to me, even though we lived under the same roof. She said the nights were long, and that the sound of the proofing oven reminded her of our wedding night, when it had rained so hard, the cake melted before we even cut it. She said she didn't know what kind of man Ethan would become, but she hoped he'd love the bakery not for what it gave him, but for what it taught him to keep. She had underlined the word keep twice. As I read on, the letters formed a spine, a hidden archive of emotions we had never spoken aloud. Margaret had written one after her mother died. She said the silence at the front counter felt like grief had baked itself into the walls. She had written again the year the city threatened to demolish our block. She wrote about staying up late, baking loaves we couldn't sell, just so the oven stayed hot and the lights stayed on. She believed that warmth could make a place look alive, even when the book said otherwise. I found one from the landlord, the old one, before he passed the deed to the corporation that now filed papers through faceless names. He had thanked us. He said our bakery kept the street safe, that the smell of fresh bread was a kind of watchman, that no one tagged walls or smashed windows where cinnamon lived in the air. He had included a handwritten clause, one not in any of the city records, granting us perpetual leasehold rights for $1 a year, contingent upon continuous operation. I had forgotten that. Ethan surely never knew. Beneath the last envelope was a small notebook, Margaret's handwriting again, but different, tighter, like she was afraid someone else might read it. I flipped through the pages slowly. There were observations, fears, musings about Ethan's teenage years. She had written about the time he lied about where he was, and how she followed him to the old railroad bridge. She watched him from the shadows, smoking with kids who looked like they'd never eaten a home-cooked meal. She didn't stop him. She wrote that she wanted him to feel like he had secrets, so he'd one day value trust. But she worried he'd learn to hide instead. And then there was a final page, one I had never seen. She had written it just after her diagnosis. The ink was shakier. She said she hoped, if I ever needed to remind Ethan who he was, I'd bring him down to the basement, and then up again through these letters. She said he wouldn't listen to me, but he might listen to time, to the voices that wrote themselves into paper when no one else was looking. I stayed there for hours, the letters scattered around me like breadcrumbs across a kitchen floor. Outside, I heard the dull hum of trucks passing, the occasional shout of a teenager, the rustle of wind along the gutter. But inside, it was still, as if the bakery itself was holding its breath. I gathered the letters and returned them to the drawer, replacing the false back, sealing them again in their waxed cloth, tying the string not too tightly. The weight of the words lingered on my chest as I stood. I didn't know what Ethan would do next, whether the sale would go through or if he would come to his senses. But I had something now. Not leverage in the legal sense, but in the moral one. Proof of intention, of continuity, of soul. I could show him numbers, deeds, contracts, but I knew now that I had something better. I had the voices of the ones who built this place without asking for applause. The ones who whispered through pen and ink and trusted that the right eyes would one day understand. The air inside the bakery that morning felt colder than usual, even though the ovens were on, and the scent of vanilla had begun to creep through the vents. There was a hollowness to the sound of footsteps across the tiled floor, as if the walls were retreating from the voices that used to fill them. I sat alone at the counter with a cup of black coffee in my hand, untouched. The mug left a small ring of moisture on the ledge where Margaret used to place warm pastries for customers who couldn't pay. The space across from me, once busy with lists and laughter, was now silent. Ethan arrived late. He always did lately. He walked in with the energy of a man who had already made up his mind and was just waiting for the world to catch up. His clothes were sharp, his hair too carefully styled for someone who claimed to be exhausted. I watched him move through the space like a visitor, glancing at everything with a certain detachment, as if evaluating what could be sold and what could be scrapped. He didn't carry the smell of flour anymore. He smelled like cologne and ink. He opened his tablet and began tapping, scrolling through pages that had nothing to do with baking or family. The building, I knew, was already listed on one of those commercial websites. A photograph of our front window, slightly crooked, had been uploaded with a caption that called it a quaint but outdated business in a gentrifying neighborhood. I had stared at that description the night before, trying to decide whether quaint was meant to be praise or pity. He showed me numbers, charts, figures that seemed precise and unfeeling. He said the bakery had been running at a loss for years, that we were clinging to something the community no longer needed, that franchises with better margins and delivery systems were pushing out emotionally attached micro-businesses. I watched his lips move and heard none of it. What I did hear was the laughter. His laughter. Thin, sharp, dismissive. The kind of laughter that didn't warm a room but hollowed it out. He laughed when he talked about the price the buyers had offered. He said they couldn't believe how cheap we were willing to go. He said it like it was a win. I looked at the floorboards beneath him and felt something turn in my chest. Beneath those boards lay more than old flour and memories. But he didn't know that. He hadn't gone down there. Not really. He had peeked into the stairwell once, years ago, and said it smelled like rust and ghosts. And that had been the end of his curiosity. I asked him if he had ever read any of the letters. He shook his head, shrugged like it didn't matter. He said legacy was a word people used when they didn't know how to move forward. He said nostalgia was the biggest weight dragging down American small business. He smiled when he said it, as if he'd just quoted something clever from a podcast. Then he laughed again, but the sound of it bounced off the walls like an echo from someone I didn't recognize. That laugh followed me for hours after he left. It lingered in the cracks of the ceiling, in the grooves of the wooden spoons, in the seams of Margaret's apron still hanging behind the door. I moved through the bakery slowly, placing my hand on surfaces as if trying to anchor myself. The counter was smooth and worn. The mixing table still bore a faint ring where the biggest bowl always sat. The oven made a low groan, the same one it had made for decades, complaining like an old friend. I went down to the basement. The steps creaked as they always had, but there was a heaviness to each one now, as though the building itself had started to mourn. The basement was cool and dry. The concrete was firm under my feet. I reached the far wall, the one with the markings from my father's time, the pencil lines we never painted over. In the far corner, behind the empty flour sacks and the boxes of holiday tins, was the hatch. It was flush with the floor and easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. I hadn't opened it in years. When I lifted it, the hinges cried softly. The smell was the same, earthy, dense, faintly sweet. I climbed down the narrow ladder and let the dark surround me for a moment. Then I switched on the bulb. A single low-hanging light revealed the old cellar, stone-lined, dry, preserved by accident and time. Shelves of wooden boxes lined one wall. Not ingredients, not money, but records, history, ledgers from before the war, receipts from trades done in kind, in favors, in community trust, photographs, letters, papers bearing signatures that hadn't been seen in decades. And in the very back, a chest, not large, but carved by hand, with initials I hadn't looked at in too long. I opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in linen, were deeds, original documents, land agreements, not just for the bakery, but for the block surrounding it. Parcels of property quietly handed from family to family, from trust to trust, all managed beneath the radar of commercial development. No one had updated them in years, but the language was clear. Contingency clauses, protection rights, historical preservation rights if applied correctly. It wasn't gold, not in the literal sense, but in the right hands, with the right timing, it could mean something. It could mean the bakery wasn't his to sell. Not entirely. I sat in that dim light and thought about his laughter again, about the emptiness of it, the way it rang with pride, but not depth. It wasn't the sound of someone who loved. It was the sound of someone who thought they'd won, and maybe they had, for a moment. But I knew what he didn't. I knew where the paper trail ended and where it began again in ink so old it had nearly faded. I knew that behind every laugh, there's a breath, and breath runs out. When I climbed back upstairs, the bakery felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but steadier, as though the foundations had remembered themselves. I wiped down the counter, flipped the sign to closed, and locked the door. I didn't know what I would do tomorrow, but I knew I wouldn't move in silence anymore. Not when the laughter he left behind was so empty, it echoed without end. I spent that night at the kitchen table with the papers laid out before me, like old ghosts returning to remind me of who I used to be. The chest I had carried up from the basement sat beside me, still smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. I hadn't seen most of these documents in years, some not since Margaret was alive. She used to joke that I was the last man in town who believed in paperwork more than passwords. I never told her how much comfort the weight of paper gave me. It was something solid, something that aged honestly, yellowing at the edges and wrinkling with the weather, not like screens that went dark without warning. I picked through the ledgers first, running my fingers over the ink that had blurred slightly from the humidity. My father's handwriting was careful, deliberate, full of loops and tails that made every line feel like it had been written with ceremony. He'd written by candlelight some nights, when the power went out, but the baking couldn't stop. I traced the curve of his signature and felt the steady beat of my own heart rise to meet it. Names, dates, trades, debts settled with loaves and favors. It was all there. But what caught my eye wasn't the business itself. It was the contract, folded neatly in the back of a leather-bound folder, brittle along the creases, but intact. It wasn't just any contract. It was the original deed of trust between my grandfather and the city council, dated 1929, a preservation agreement, born during the last days of the Great Depression, when small family businesses were crumbling and developers were circling like crows over the carcasses of old neighborhoods. In exchange for hosting food banks in the basement and providing bread for the local orphanage once a week for 20 years, the bakery and the lot it stood on were given special designation. Protected, not from taxes, not from hardship, but from sale without familial consensus and historical review. It wasn't a bulletproof wall, but it was a gate, and Ethan hadn't even noticed it. I read the clause 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My grandfather had been meticulous. The language was dated, but the intent was clear. Any sale, lease, or transfer of ownership outside the bloodline, or without the documented consent of at least 3 living descendants, would trigger an automatic injunction under city ordinance, still active due to automatic renewal clauses and the bakery's historical footprint. It was obscure, almost buried, but it was real and legally enforceable. Ethan had never read it. Of that I was certain. He'd skimmed summaries and profit-loss statements, But he never once asked about the old files. To him, the past was sentimental clutter. He lived by charts and projections, not by ink and memory. But the city clerk I called the next morning did remember. A woman with a tired voice and a laugh that sounded like coffee being poured into a chipped mug. She said the ordinance was still in effect, that the file still existed in hard copy, that no one had called about it in decades. She mailed me a certified copy. I waited at the bakery for the delivery, hands folded, eyes fixed on the same door Margaret used to decorate with paper snowflakes in the winter. When the envelope arrived, I didn't open it right away. I made a cup of tea and stood at the front window, watching people pass with phones in their hands and earbuds in their ears, never noticing the smell of cinnamon or the faded sign with our name in cursive. Then I opened the document. The city's seal stamped across the top made it real in a way I hadn't expected. Suddenly, I wasn't just a man guarding a crumbling bakery. I was a trustee, a holder of something heavier than flour. The contract included a map, one Ethan had never seen, highlighting the boundaries of the property in red ink. Not just the building, but the alley behind it, the side garden Margaret once planted with herbs, even the patch of asphalt Ethan had once called wasted space. All of it was covered under the protection clause. It wasn't wealth, but it was leverage. I called a lawyer I trusted, a quiet man, older than Ethan, who still used a fountain pen and kept his office 3 blocks from the courthouse. He didn't laugh when I read him the language. He didn't scoff at the dates or the paper or the ink. He asked for a copy and called me back 3 hours later with his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. He told me I had a right Ethan didn't expect, that the pending sale could be paused, that the title company had already skipped over required disclosures, that someone had gotten greedy or sloppy, or both. The smile that crossed my face wasn't one of triumph. It was something quieter, like a sigh held for too long. I didn't want to ruin Ethan. I just wanted him to understand that some things didn't belong on spreadsheets. Some things weren't measured in market value or foot traffic. Some things needed to be held in the palm of your hand, felt, studied, passed down like a recipe you didn't dare change. But he had already signed papers. He had already set a closing date. He had moved too fast, too confident that no one else was watching. I wasn't going to stop him with noise. I wasn't going to confront him in a scene. I was going to let the papers speak. I was going to let the past whisper through signatures and seals and pages he'd never cared to touch. When the time came, I would file the injunction. The city would send their letter. The buyers would pause. And Ethan would have to sit in a room with me and listen. And when he did, I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't accuse. I would slide the document across the table, and I would watch his eyes try to process a story he thought was already his to end. He had called the bakery a failure. He had laughed at its value. But he had never read the contract. He never knew what lay beneath the words he skipped. And I, the man he thought too old and too tired to matter, was still holding the original ink. The contract no one read was the page that would turn everything. The morning the letter arrived at City Hall, something in the rhythm of Main Street shifted. I felt it before I saw it, a kind of slowing down, as if the old bones of the town were pausing mid-step to remember something they hadn't thought of in years. For a long time, this place had sleepwalked through change, swallowing chain stores and real estate agents like a tired man swallowing pills, not because he believed in the cure, but because it was easier than arguing with the symptoms. But that morning, something paused, and in that pause, the old town stirred. I arrived early, walking the 3 blocks from the bakery with my coat zipped against the wind and my fingers curled inside my gloves. I didn't carry the original documents with me that day. They were locked in a fireproof box at home, exactly where they belonged. But I had the copy from the lawyer, folded neatly inside an envelope that felt heavier than it should have, like it had soaked up the weight of everything it represented. The clerk at the counter knew my name before I said it. She was young, maybe the age Margaret had been when we met, with short dark hair and clear eyes that didn't blink when she took the envelope from me. I watched her slide it into a tray marked Historical Review, and she gave me a faint nod, not of understanding, but of recognition. As if some unspoken signal had passed between us, one that said the past was no longer silent. The letter triggered a chain that couldn't be undone. By noon, the Preservation Society had been notified. By 2 o'clock, a notice went up on the city website. I didn't have social media, but a neighbor's grandson printed the page for me, and I read it at the kitchen table like a man reading his own name in a registry he'd forgotten existed. The bakery, it said, was under review for historical exemption. All pending transactions would be placed on hold. Any alteration of the structure, including the transfer of ownership or demolition, was prohibited until the board completed its review. Ethan didn't call. I knew he'd seen it. There was no way he hadn't. But he didn't call. That silence told me everything I needed to know about his guilt. He hadn't just missed the clause. He had deliberately skipped it, convinced that no one would remember the ink of a forgotten century. He underestimated not just me, but the town itself. Because the town remembered. The next morning, I walked to the bakery as I always had, but the air felt different. It was crisp, clear, with a bite that reminded me of the way the sky used to feel in the early 60s, when Margaret would open the front door just to let in the scent of snow. The sidewalk was busier than usual for a Thursday, not with shoppers or tourists, but with neighbors. Old neighbors. People I hadn't spoken to in years. They didn't say anything. Some simply passed. Some paused at the window and placed a hand on the glass. I recognized their faces. Retired teachers. Vietnam vets. The woman who once owned the flower shop before her daughter turned it into a vape store. The man who'd lost his wife and used to come in every Saturday for a walnut roll and a quiet place to cry. They remembered. By noon, there were letters. Not emails. Not posts. Real letters. In envelopes with stamps, slid under the bakery door like petals dropped by an unseen hand. Testimonies. Memories. Declarations of what this place meant to them. Some were short. Some rambled. Some were written in blocky print on lined paper. One was typed on an old typewriter ribbon, so faint I had to hold it to the light. They spoke of christenings, funerals, birthdays. They spoke of the smell of rye bread in December and the sound of the old bell that used to hang above the entrance. They spoke of a place that had been more than a shop. It had been a ritual, a landmark, a promise that some parts of life didn't change overnight. I sorted them into stacks on the counter. The old register sat beside me like a silent witness, still with the drawer that stuck slightly to the left. I ran a cloth over the glass and set out 2 trays of leftover almond cookies from the freezer. People took them, one by one, with quiet hands and eyes that searched mine not for answers, but for permission. Permission to care again. Permission to remember. The local paper called. Not a reporter I knew, but someone who said they had grown up 2 streets over. They asked if they could stop by. I said yes, even though I had no intention of saying much. I didn't need to. The story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the walls, to the cracks in the plaster, to the recipes scratched on yellowed index cards. The reporter didn't stay long. Took a few pictures, jotted down a quote I hadn't meant to give. Something about how places that feed people shouldn't be sold like gas stations. It made the headline. That weekend, something happened I hadn't expected. A small group of college students came by, art majors or something like that, with sketchbooks and point-and-shoot cameras. They asked if they could draw the storefront. I let them. They sat on the sidewalk, on milk crates and folded blankets, and for 3 hours they captured the building in charcoal and pencil like they were sketching a cathedral. I watched from inside, the heat of the oven warming my spine, and something in me settled. not because I believed they could stop the sale, but because I saw in their eyes that they knew it mattered. The town was waking up, not in a grand, cinematic way. There were no protests, no brass bands, but in the small, stubborn ways that mattered. A local judge sent a letter to the Preservation Board. A retired city planner dropped off the original zoning maps, showing how the bakery had shaped the block. A mother brought in her daughter to see the wall where generations had carved initials into the wood. And on Sunday morning, a small line formed before I unlocked the door. No one asked for anything. They just wanted to be inside. I didn't ask why. I just kept the lights on. The first new face appeared on a Wednesday afternoon, just after the rain had stopped. The windows were still beaded with drops, and the street shimmered in that silver-gray way that made the whole town feel like it had been dipped in mercury. I had just finished restocking the shelf of old recipe books in the corner when the door creaked open. At first, I thought it might be one of the usuals, someone coming in for warmth more than bread. But then I saw her eyes. She looked around like someone entering a sacred space, not a bakery. Her coat was too clean, her shoes too modern. She didn't smell like flour or wood smoke. She smelled like airports and printer toner. She wasn't from here. Not really. She wandered past the counter without saying a word, pausing at the window that overlooked the alley where the delivery trucks used to park. Her hands stayed in her pockets, but her shoulders told the story. She wasn't here for bread. She was here to see if the stories were true. I stood behind the counter and waited. She left without buying anything, but before the door closed behind her, she looked over her shoulder just long enough for me to see what I needed. Recognition. Not of me. Of the place. She had known about this building before her feet touched the floorboards. Someone had told her. Or maybe she had read it somewhere. By the weekend, they came in pairs. A man in a wool cap who asked about the moldings. A woman in a trench coat who took photographs of the baseboards. Two younger people who pointed at the ceiling and whispered to each other like art students analyzing brushwork in a gallery. They came with notebooks, with measuring tapes, with questions they didn't ask out loud. I let them wander. I watched their eyes. They weren't from here either. Some left without a word. Some smiled. A tight smile that didn't quite reach their cheeks. A few took pictures of me, pretending to be interested in the scones, but I knew better. They were cataloging the past before erasing it, recording evidence before removal. I'd seen that look before, years ago, when the old library had been torn down for the parking lot. The same quiet detachment, like an undertaker taking measurements for a casket before the body's even cold. And yet, not all of them felt the same. There was one who lingered, a young man, maybe in his late 20s, with calloused hands and a leather notebook that he didn't hide. He asked questions, not about the building, but about the town, about the people, about the stories. He sat at one of the small round tables near the window and opened a sketch pad, drawing the street outside while the light shifted through the dusty glass. I refilled the coffee urn that morning, even though no one had asked for it, and he poured himself a cup without hesitation. He stayed until closing, and when he left he looked back twice, like he wasn't quite ready to let go of the air inside. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the building, not for security, for memory. The alley still smelled of yeast and cardboard, the vents still hummed, the dumpster still bore the scratch marks from when it had been dragged across the asphalt during a storm. I touched the bricks, feeling for cracks, as if checking the pulse of an old friend. The mortar had darkened over the years, but the structure held. It had outlasted storms, vandalism, economic dips, and at least 2 fires. I didn't know if it could outlast this new wave of interest, but it hadn't let go yet. One morning, a glossy flyer appeared under the door, a logo I didn't recognize, a tagline about revitalizing heritage through thoughtful reinvention. They always used phrases like that, words that sounded respectful but carried the scent of demolition. I folded it once, twice, then slid it between the pages of Margaret's cookbook. Let them try. The faces multiplied. Realtors in sharp blazers who smelled like citrus and ambition. Planners with rolled blueprints tucked under their arms. Even a television crew, or something close to it. A man with a camera the size of a microwave, and another with a microphone on a long pole. They asked no questions, filmed the exterior, and left within minutes. Probably stock footage for a before segment. I didn't give them the after. Through it all, the town kept watching. Locals came more often, sometimes bringing their children, sometimes just sitting with a coffee they didn't touch. I started leaving blank notebooks on the tables, with pens attached by twine. I didn't say why, but they knew. Pages began to fill. Not poetry or protest, just memories. This is where I sat after Mom's surgery. My first kiss was on the third stool by the window. He proposed to me on a Wednesday. We bought cinnamon rolls after. The notebooks became heavier by the day, their spines swollen with the weight of recollection. One afternoon, as the sun carved long lines across the counter, a woman with silver hair and a fur-lined coat entered. She looked like she belonged in a magazine, but her hands trembled slightly when she placed them on the glass. She told me she had once lived in the apartment above the bakery when she was 19, and that the floorboards in the bedroom used to sing when it rained. She walked to the back, where the narrow staircase curled upward into shadow. She didn't climb it, just stared, then nodded, turned, and left. It wasn't just my memories this place held. It was a reservoir. That evening, I sat by the window with the lights off and watched the reflection of the street move across the glass. I saw the old shapes in the new faces, the way the shadows curled around their shoulders, the way their heads tilted in the same curious angle as Margaret's had when she inspected a fresh loaf. They were trying to claim something they hadn't earned. They thought that by owning the walls, they could own the story. But the story had its own shape. It had been written in burnt crusts and scuffed tiles, in laughter and grief and shared silence, and no amount of money could rewrite that. The final visitor that week didn't enter. She stood across the street, a clipboard in her hands, and stared for nearly 20 minutes. I watched her from the crack between the curtains. She was calculating something. Not price, not square footage. Risk. She knew what had been set in motion, and she wasn't sure if it could be stopped, or if it should be. The town had changed. It always did. But this time, it remembered itself. And while the new faces kept arriving, each with their plans and their schemes, I could feel the old town pushing back. Not with rage, but with memory, with presence, with stories too wide for forms and deeds. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew the fight had already begun. And I wasn't the only one standing guard. The wind started before dawn, not a gentle breeze or a passing gust, but a deep, insistent current that pressed against the windows and rattled the frames like a restless memory trying to get in. It carried the scent of old rain and something older still, something that lived in attics and between the pages of forgotten books. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to it push against the house. It didn't sound angry. It sounded inevitable. By the time I stepped outside, the street was littered with torn leaves and stray papers. A rusted street sign swung back and forth, squeaking like a weather vane in protest. I pulled my coat tighter and began the walk toward the bakery. The air felt dense with meaning, like the moments before a storm, though the sky stayed clear. That wind wasn't bringing weather. It was bringing something else. Or perhaps it was pulling something out, something long buried and never properly grieved. The door of the bakery stuck in its frame when I tried to open it. I had to lean into it with my shoulder until it finally gave. The chime above rang out like a warning bell. Inside, the place felt different. Not cold exactly, but emptied out, like it had exhaled something during the night and hadn't pulled it back in. The dust hadn't moved, the chairs hadn't shifted, but I felt the absence of something I couldn't name. I turned on the lights, but they flickered, as if the building itself hesitated to wake. As I made my way toward the back, past the counter and the half-unpacked boxes of flour, I noticed the floorboards near the storage door had warped slightly. A thin crack had appeared between them, revealing a dark line like the edge of a secret. I knelt and ran my hand along the grain, feeling how the wood resisted me, as though it remembered what lay beneath. This place had always hidden its past well, too well, but now the wind had stirred it loose. I went to the basement. The stairs creaked more than usual, each step echoing louder than the last. The air grew thicker the farther I descended, not with moisture, but with weight. History clung to the stone walls, and the old beams above groaned like they remembered the people who had nailed them into place. I reached the bottom and turned on the single bare bulb that swung from the ceiling. Its light was weak and yellow, casting long shadows across the floor. Boxes lined the walls, some marked, some not. I opened a few at random. Old ledgers, receipts, photographs with curling edges, names I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Some I barely recognized. The past didn't age the way people did. It stayed sharp and unfinished, waiting to be acknowledged. I found an envelope addressed in a familiar hand, mine, from a time when my writing was steadier and my belief in permanence stronger. It was sealed, but I knew what was inside. I had written those letters when the bakery almost closed the first time. I had written them to the town council, to the preservation committee, to my brother. No one had answered. I sat on the old wooden stool beside the furnace and closed my eyes. The wind outside picked up again, and I could hear it even here, like it had fingers reaching through the cracks in the foundation. It wasn't trying to take anything. It was reminding, calling. The things we try to forget never disappear. They wait in corners and crawl spaces, behind mirrors and inside clocks. They wait for the day when silence becomes too heavy to carry. I spent the morning sorting through the boxes. I laid out old menus, typed in faded ink. I found a ledger from the year the bakery opened, prices handwritten in cents, margins in pencil. There was a note from Margaret, folded between the pages of a bread order, her script dancing like she had been humming while she wrote it. She had signed it with a smiley face. She had done that when she wanted to soften the blow of bad news. That day, it had been about a shipment that never arrived, but the note felt heavier now, like she had known it would one day be read in a different light. By afternoon, the sky had darkened, even though no clouds had arrived. It was the wind again, stirring up dust and pollen and everything else that should have stayed settled. People walked by outside with their collars up, their eyes squinting against gusts that didn't carry rain, only memory. Some paused to look through the bakery window, their faces briefly distorted by the old glass. I stayed seated behind the counter, watching them without moving. I wondered how many of them felt it too. That pull, that shift. A man I hadn't seen in years walked past. He didn't see me, but I recognized his stride, the way he tilted slightly to the left like he was dodging a weight on his shoulder. We had once argued in this very room, over prices, over tradition, over what the bakery meant to the town. He had wanted to modernize. I had refused. He had left in anger. Now he walked slower, thinner, grayer, but the same wind pushed at his back. That evening, I unlocked the hidden drawer beneath the register. I hadn't opened it in over a decade. Inside, wrapped in linen, were the original blueprints, the ones Margaret and I had drawn up on the floor of our first apartment using a ruler and too much optimism. The paper had yellowed, but the lines were clear. There were notes in the margins, tiny dreams scribbled in ink. Window seat here for rainy days. Counter with view of the hills. Shelves low enough for children to reach. We had wanted the bakery to feel like a place where time softened, not sharpened. I left the blueprints on the counter. The next morning, the wind was gone. The sky was still, too still. The town looked paused, like someone had pressed a button in the middle of a breath. I walked to the bakery without my coat. The sun had returned, but it didn't warm. It only illuminated. I opened the door and stepped inside, expecting the familiar chime, but it didn't sound. The wire had snapped during the night. A small thing, but not meaningless. On the table near the window, someone had left a notebook. Not one of mine. This one was leather-bound, the pages thick. I opened it. There were only 2 words inside, written in block letters across the first page. "We remember." I closed it and set it beside the blueprints. Then I turned on the oven, mixed the dough, and prepared the trays. The building didn't need to speak. It had the wind, and the wind had done its work. The past wasn't behind us anymore. It was awake, and it had come to stay. I knew it was coming, long before it arrived. There had been signs, not the loud kind, not the breaking glass sort of signals, but quiet shifts, like the sound of a tree cracking on the inside before it falls. I had felt it in my bones for days, maybe even weeks, the way the floor creaked differently beneath my feet, the way silence began to stretch itself thin between each passing morning. Something had been unraveling, slowly, as if time itself was pulling threads from the hem of the life I thought I still wore. The bakery was empty that morning. The shelves were stocked, the lights were on, but the silence was sharper than usual. Even the dust motes in the air seemed hesitant, as if the sun's light didn't have permission to warm them. I watched the clock tick forward, minute by minute, as the world outside moved as if on mute. It wasn't that no one came in, it was that I didn't expect them to. I wasn't open, not really. I was holding a structure that looked like it was, going through the motions, keeping the facade alive a little longer. Then the bell rang. Not the soft chime I remembered. Not the one Margaret used to say reminded her of church bells in the distance. This one was metallic, direct, almost surgical. It sliced through the stillness and cut something loose inside me. I didn't stand up. I didn't need to. I knew who it was. He stepped inside, like he owned the air. His shoulders were broad, his jacket too expensive for a town like this, his shoes clicking too cleanly against the old wooden floor. He carried a folder under his arm, thick with certainty. His hair was trimmed in a way that made him look younger than he was. But I knew better. I knew exactly how many years had passed since I last saw him, and I remembered every word from the letter he'd sent before disappearing. He looked around like he didn't recognize it, like he was measuring the space against a blueprint he'd memorized, but never truly understood. I watched his eyes move over the display case, the faded chalkboard menu, the walls that still held warmth from generations of early mornings. He didn't smell the cinnamon in the floorboards. He didn't hear the echo of kneading hands or laughter from a time when we didn't need folders to speak. He spoke, but I heard nothing. Words were lost on me then. My eyes went to his hands. They were steady, manicured, unfamiliar. Not the hands that had once reached across the counter to steal a roll when he thought I wasn't looking. Not the hands that had helped paint the front sign when he was 13 and impatient. These hands were careful. Business hands. Contract hands. He placed the folder on the counter. It made a sound heavier than paper should. He tapped it once with his fingers, as if to say, "This is it. This is what we've come to." I didn't move. The wind outside had picked up again, and the glass door trembled in its frame. I could feel the pressure in my ears, like before a storm. Eventually, he opened it for me. Pages fluttered like wings preparing to leave. There were diagrams, valuations, timelines. There were words like acquisition and redevelopment and residential potential. There were bullet points and signatures and digital printouts of the property from above, as though this building had ever meant anything from a bird's-eye view. He didn't look at me while he explained it all. He looked past me, or maybe through me, toward some imagined skyline where this old place no longer stood. I finally stood. My chair scraped the floor, and the sound startled us both. I reached for the folder, not to read it, but to close it. The slap of paper against paper echoed in the room. He flinched just a little, as if something had shifted. I could feel the tear then, not in the pages, but in the space between us. A rupture. The moment when two timelines, father and son, past and future, split for good. He spoke again, slower this time, and his voice almost cracked when he said my name. Not Dad, just the name, as if trying to unbraid blood into something neutral. I turned away, walked behind the counter, touched the edge of the cash register like it might ground me. My fingers traced the grooves worn into the wood, the little place where Margaret once carved a heart so small no one else ever noticed it. He came closer. I felt the change in air, the warmth of him approaching like the memory of a fire that no longer burned. I didn't turn. I didn't want to see what was left of the boy I once held in my arms. I only wanted to remember what he was before ambition replaced affection, before plans turned into blueprints and family became leverage. He said something about legacy. I exhaled through my nose. Legacy, to him, was a brand. To me, it was the sound of my wife singing as she rolled dough. It was the fingerprints on the windows from neighborhood kids pressing their noses against the glass. It was the smell of burnt sugar and the silence of mourning and the laughter of recovery. His legacy fit in a folder. Mine was nailed into the floor. When he realized I wasn't going to answer, he reached into his pocket and placed a key on the counter. My key. The one I had given him when he said he wanted to take care of the place. It sat there, a simple metal thing, cold and indifferent. I stared at it. So many years, and now everything came back to this. A piece of metal on old wood and silence between two people who no longer shared a name in anything but ink. He left. The door closed behind him, the chime still broken. I waited until I could no longer hear his car. Then I walked to the door, locked it, and turned the sign to closed. I flipped off the lights and stood in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the dim outlines of everything I had built. There was no drama in the break, no raised voices or slammed fists, just a quiet detachment, like a thread snapping in the middle of a loom. You don't see it at first. You only notice when the pattern begins to unravel. I sat back down and looked at the folder still lying there like a sealed verdict. I didn't open it again. That evening, I took the key and buried it in the garden behind the bakery, under the rosemary bush that Margaret loved. The soil was dry, but it accepted the metal without protest. I covered it with earth and pressed it down with both hands, not as an act of war, not as revenge, just as a goodbye. Not to him, but to the version of him I had loved, the version that still smelled of yeast and chalk dust, who had once fallen asleep on a flour sack while I worked late into the night. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the branches. It didn't ask questions. It didn't make promises. It just moved, as it always did, carrying pieces of the past and scattering them where they would not be found again. The break had happened, and something inside me, quietly, accepted it. The morning came colder than usual, even though the calendar claimed it was spring. The sun rose reluctantly, casting a pale light across the kitchen tiles, but it brought no warmth. The coffee machine sputtered to life out of habit, and I stood there waiting, not for caffeine, but for a reason to begin the day. The house felt hollow, like a dried-out shell, retaining only the echo of its purpose. I had lived in many silences over the years, but this one, this silence, had weight. It pressed against my chest, and wrapped itself around my shoulders like a wet coat I could never quite take off. The papers sat on the table, precisely stacked, just as I had left them the night before. Legal language in small, unforgiving fonts, valuations, transfer clauses, estate projections. It was all there, spelling out in plain terms what they thought I was worth. Not me exactly, but the things I had. The things they had circled around like birds too impatient to wait for the dying to be done. The price of the house, the value of the bakery, the anticipated returns from the land, all reduced to lines and digits. My life, divided by decimal points. I poured the coffee. It was bitter. I drank it anyway. Later that morning, the notary came. She was young, perhaps too young to understand the tension in the air, or maybe too professional to acknowledge it. Her briefcase was polished, her blouse unwrinkled, her smile practiced. She said things like, "only a formality," and "standard procedure," as she laid out the final draft of the documents. I nodded. I signed. My hand didn't shake, but I felt each stroke in my bones. She left quickly. Efficiency was her currency. I stood by the window for a long time afterward, staring at the cracked pavement in the driveway, the same place where my son once fell, learning to ride his bike. He had scraped his knees and cried, and I had carried him inside, his small arms wrapped around my neck, sobbing into my collar. That patch of concrete still held a faint stain, oil perhaps, or time itself leaking through the seams. It reminded me of permanence, of the things we don't notice until they're the only things left. They came that afternoon, my son and his wife. She wore something expensive and cold. He looked uncomfortable, like someone playing the role of a grateful child, but forgetting the lines. They smiled too much. Their gratitude was brittle, forced around the edges, too eager. They called me generous, wise, understanding. Words that once meant something, but now felt like cushioning wrapped around a blade. I listened. I let them speak. I said little. He glanced at the folder on the counter, the same one that had been passed back and forth for weeks. Inside, it was the deed, the bakery, the house, all of it. I had agreed, on paper, to pass it along, to ensure the next generation would thrive. That was the phrase he liked to use. Thrive. As though success was a light switch he could flick on with the right signature. But the real cost wasn't written in the documents. It was written in the days I had poured into those walls, the nights I had slept on flour sacks because we couldn't afford a bed, the years Margaret and I had spent scrubbing floors and balancing books and keeping the lights on when there was nothing left to burn. But hope. None of that had a line on the balance sheet. None of that was considered liquid. And yet, it had been everything. I excused myself and walked into the garden. The rosemary had started to bloom. The scent hit me in a wave, sudden and disarming. It carried me back to Sundays with Margaret, to dinners on the porch, to laughter that no longer echoed. I bent down and ran my fingers through the soil. It was warm, soft, alive. I thought of the key buried there, and for a moment I almost reached for it. But no. Some things were better left underground. They didn't stay long. Once the formalities were done, once the ink dried, they left with their smiles and plans. I watched their car disappear down the road, their future bought with my past. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. There was a kind of sadness that doesn't sharpen into rage, but settles like dust, layering over everything until the colors fade. I went back inside and sat at the table. The sun had shifted. Its light slanted across the floor, picking up the faded lines where the rug had once lain. I sat there and traced those lines with my eyes, as if trying to remember what they had once held. A crib, a rocking chair, a low table built from scrap wood. Memories that had shaped the floor as much as feet ever had. That evening, I lit a fire in the hearth, not because it was cold, but because the crackle of wood burning felt honest. Margaret used to say the fire spoke if you listened right. That night I listened. It didn't say much, but what it said was clear. There are prices we pay that don't show up on invoices. There are debts written in time and hands and breath, and when we sign them away, we give more than we know. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for this part of the story. Instead, I sat with the warmth of the flames on my skin and the weight of what I had given pressing gently against my ribs. The house was quiet again, but no longer hollow. It had absorbed what it needed, and I, in return, had learned what it meant to give everything without losing myself. The real cost wasn't the property or the inheritance or the balance of the bank account. It was the recognition that value cannot always be measured in numbers. That legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we choose to carry forward, even when no one else sees it. That night, I slept with the window open. The wind moved through the curtains like a memory, soft and persistent. It carried no promises, only truth. And that, finally, was enough. The morning the letter arrived, the air smelled like old ink and faded sunlight. I was sitting at the same kitchen table where Margaret once kept her recipe books stacked in uneven towers, and where my son used to do his homework, chewing pens and grumbling about math. The wood had worn smooth under my forearms. My eyes had grown weaker over the years, but I still recognized the handwriting on the envelope, though it had matured. Deliberate, crisp, controlled. It was hers. My granddaughter, Claire. The name alone pulled at something in my chest I hadn't acknowledged in months. Since the transfer, since the visit stopped, since the silence settled thick across the weeks like dust in an unused attic, I hadn't heard from any of them, not even Claire. I told myself it was better that way. Cleaner. No threads left dangling. No false hopes for reconciliation or revision. But as I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the paper, I realized I had still left one page unturned. Her words were kind, tentative. She spoke of college, of books she'd found in the attic, of how she'd stumbled across an old photo album with my notes scrawled along the borders in faded blue pen. She said she missed the smell of fresh bread. She remembered how I used to hum when I kneaded dough, and how the windows always fogged in winter when the ovens were full. She asked if I was well. She asked if I remembered the stories I used to tell her about the hills in my hometown. She ended the letter with something simple. Can I visit? I sat with that question for hours. The past year had been full of such moments, crossroads that appeared without warning. Some I ignored, some I faced. This one, though, felt different. Not a demand, not a test, just a child, now grown, reaching backward into something she had once believed in. Maybe that was what memory really was. Not a recording of truth, but a shared agreement to keep something alive between us, even if the rest had decayed. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked to the old study. The air in there held the quiet hush of long-forgotten plans. The desk was still there. The leather chair. The broken lamp I never replaced. I opened the drawer slowly, like opening a wound, and pulled out the journal I hadn't touched in months. Its cover was cracked, the edges frayed. It was the one Margaret had given me decades ago, before the bakery even opened. Write it all down, she'd said. Even the things you want to forget. I flipped past the early pages. Lists of ingredients, notes on suppliers, sketches of shelving arrangements. Then the entries changed. Lines about the birth of our son, about our first profit, about the summer we couldn't pay rent but smiled through every meal anyway. Pages of joy and pages of failure. Then came the long spaces of grief after Margaret died. Then shorter entries, fragmented, tight. Then silence. I turned to the very last page I had written. It ended with a date and a sentence. He took the keys today. Nothing else. So much had happened since then. yet I had written none of it. I stared at the blank pages that remained, yellowing slightly, waiting. I picked up the pen and began again. I wrote about the day I watched them pack the bakery's shelves with things that didn't belong. Neon pastries, frozen dough, noise where there used to be care. I wrote about the emptiness of the house once the familiar voices left, once the walls stopped vibrating with memory. I wrote about the silence in my bones, about how I tried to fight it, then learned to live with it. I wrote about the day I buried the key in the rosemary bush and how I felt a strange peace doing it. I wrote about Claire's letter and what it meant to read something written not out of obligation, but memory. And then I wrote something else, something unexpected. I forgive him. The words stared back at me. They didn't change the past. They didn't erase what had been taken. But in that moment, they felt necessary. Not for him, for me. Because the story was ending, and the last page couldn't carry anger if I wanted peace to settle when I closed the book. I placed the journal back in the drawer, but left it slightly open. If Claire ever came, I wanted her to find it, not because it held answers, but because it held me. That evening, I took a walk through town. The storefronts had changed, the faces too, but the sidewalks remembered my feet. I passed the post office, the church, the old barber's, now a nail salon. I walked past the bakery without stopping, just long enough to see the fluorescent lighting, the new counters, the absent heart. I didn't linger. That wasn't my place anymore. I ended up at the park. The bench near the pond was still there. I sat down, listening to the ducks shuffle through the reeds. Children ran in the distance. The wind picked up, and with it came the scent of spring flowers and something else. Something older. A trace of flower. A trace of her. I stayed until the sky turned dark and the stars began to blink open like secrets returning to the surface. Then I walked home in silence, the kind that no longer felt like absence. When I got back, I turned off every light except the one above the kitchen sink. I sat with a second cup of coffee, though it had long gone cold. I reached into my pocket and took out Claire's letter again. I folded it carefully and slid it between the pages of a cookbook Margaret used to read every Christmas. I had no more pages to write, no more battles to win. The story had found its ending, not with a dramatic gesture, not with a shout, not with revenge or revelation, just with a breath, a pause, a letter in the mail, and a light left on in case someone came home. The last page wasn't about what was taken, it was about what remained, and it was enough.